and good evening, esteemed board members, Dr. Vishakha Desai, our guest speaker, and all of you who joined us today. I extend a warm welcome to you all from Asia Sensemaker. Despite the informal nature of our discussion at Asia Sensemaker, it has the depth and range of information of a seminar. Today we have with us Dr. Vishakha Desai, who is an internationally recognized scholar of history and art of South Asia. She is renowned for taking the lead in introducing American audience to contemporary Asian art and creating novel theories about how culture and foreign policy interact in China, India, and other Asian nations. She currently serves as Senior Advisor for Global Affairs to President Lee C. Berlinger of Columbia University and Department Chair of the Committee on Global Thought. She is a Senior Research Scholar on Global Studies at its School of International and Public Affairs. Before joining Columbia University, Dr. Vishakha Desai held various positions at the Asia Society, a leading global organization committed to strengthening partnership among the people, leaders, and institutions of Asia and United States from 1990 to 2012, initially as the director of Asia Society Museum, and for the last 8 years as president and CEO. Under her leadership as president of Asia Society, she expanded the society's reach in Asia through innovative programs and by establishing new centers in the region. Dr. Vishakha Desai joined the board of Mahindra Rise as an independent director in 2012 and is affiliated with Kriya University. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Vishakha. I would now request our Director of Research at Asia, Professor Amogh Rai, to begin the conversation.
Professor Desai, a very warm welcome once more. I also see my boss, the chairman of Asia, the former Lieutenant Governor of Delhi, that he has joined. So with your permission, ma'am, I would like to begin the conversation.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Right. So it's 7:30 in the evening. A lot of people, as you can see, they continue to join in. So some ground rules. What we do is that we have these informal conversations, we record them, and after we process them, we're going to send them over to you so that we can put them, if you have no objections, onto our YouTube channel where they are seen by a lot more people than we can accommodate here today. So first is that. Second, we'll be having a 45-minute, 50-minute long conversation, and then I'm going to open it up if you have the time and the inclination after this to take any questions. So these are the two ground rules. And with that said, I would like to begin.
Please.
So Asia, that is Advanced Study Institute of Asia, the center that we run, and you've been the CEO of the Asia Society, the global think tank. One very interesting thing that pops up when I look at your resume and the amount of work that you've done. You've worked a lot with museums, far too many to list over here, but the list is impressive. And one of the challenges that people in what we would call the developing country is this, everybody's now talking about this idea of demuseumization. So how do you get art which has been acquired, let's say, by unsavory means, let's put it like that. The whole catalog of the British Museum, for example. So a few years ago, Irene Bizzo talked about how art, which has been acquired by whatever means, but it is now sitting in these museums, and in these museums, it is being processed, interpreted, and museums play a very important role. You are an art historian. You're also a person of Indian origin. How and where do you see museums going ahead as we...
Right.
So that's the question.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I must say you're beginning with the very important and tough question of the day. So I can imagine that nothing is going to get easier after this. So thank you.
I prepared very hard because you're a scholar. After this, it gets very easy.
No, but I'm really interested, and I'm very, very excited that you actually have asked this question, only because of course, I've been in the field for more than 4 decades. And at the same time, right now, I'm actually working on a big edited volume, which is about the intersection of art and politics, or art and socio-political issues, both in a museum setting and in the art practices, with 20 authors from all around the world. So this is very much on my mind at the moment. Of course, it's in the newspapers every day. And I have to say that I think I understand why right now this question is very much about restitution and the rightful return of objects because of the decolonization debate that is going on everywhere. And it's a very important debate. And I've always felt that I think that there is such a thing as the pride of a nation, especially for the newly independent nations, since most of these colonized countries are essentially 75, 80 at the most, or even 40 years old, for some countries in Africa. So there is that issue. I understand that. And I have always argued, even in the Western museum setting, that if the object is proven stolen, it needs to be returned, no matter what, because it's a very important thing. And for things like Benin bronzes, which were actually looted from the palace as the palace was put on fire by the British soldiers, there is a reason why people feel that this has to go back. Having said that, I am also concerned because arts are one of the very few things, if maybe the only things, that actually are very unique in a human endeavor. And what I mean by that is that, and the Greeks understood this, and so did the Indians, where you talk about interaction between arts and people that actually can be both about something being a product of a place and time. Let's say a Chola bronze that was made in the 11th century in India, it is that product. But that art also has the capacity to move across place and time. So to some extent, when Malraux talked about museum without walls, he was talking about that unique perspective that arts bring. This is true of music, it's true of other performing arts, but it's particularly true of the visual arts. And therefore, how do we create a balance between art being a product of a nation, a community, a place, and its capacity to go across time and space and to actually touch hearts and souls elsewhere? So, for example, when Rembrandt looked at a Mughal picture, he was inspired to say, this is a unique, amazing thing. I want to do something. And he actually made sketches out of that. I myself had an experience the way I started in a museum, and it's in my memoir, World as Family, which I'm sure we'll get into. And that is to work as a 21-year-old coming to America and working with African-American students who didn't even know where India was. And then through dance and through actual examination of objects in the Cleveland Museum, 6 weeks later, they felt that those sculptures were their friends. They were walking around, and I felt like I was able to do something across cultures. And that is the power of art that nothing else has. So now, in the 21st century, when we have to balance the rights that have, the wrongs that have to be righted in terms of things that were taken, not everything was taken necessarily by stolen or selling things. Some things were also part of trade. For example, in a Mughal court, in Shah Jahan court, and in the Rockefeller collection, there's a beautiful blue and white plate, a large plate that we know came from Turkey through the Ottoman Empire into the Mughal court, but it was made for the Ottoman Empire in China. So you also have trade, you also have other ways that objects travel. So we have to be much more sensitive to the subtleties as well as these multiple function that objects play. And objects also have a life of their own. You know, what it was made for originally, then it gets seen in another context. How do we do that? So I think as we go forward, we need to actually create a balance between, and I understand right now the debate has moved completely towards more the restitution question, because for too long in the 20th century, it was all about Western museums having objects from all over the world, encyclopedic museums, what have you. So we have to create a balance. And that is going to be the issue of the 21st century. How do you create a balance to allow objects to serve the cross-cultural bridge idea and to have the ownership idea of who actually owns the piece?
That is actually a very detailed, and it opens up questions. But one of the things that you refer to, and that your book published 2 years ago, World as a Family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it also served as the official motto of this year's G20.
I know.
So you can actually lay credit to it because your book came out before the G20 logo was finalized. However, I mean, we are now, when your book came out, the world was in the middle of the pandemic. So that was the top problem that everybody was focused on. In 2023, as we record this, there's a war in Ukraine. There's a war in Gaza. And there are multiple micro conflicts all over. And most of these stem from identity or the notion of a particular identity. Over the last 2 years, you have given some very insightful lectures and talks. How has this idea of identity shifted? Because you talk in your book about multiple identities. You talk an identity at home, you talk about an identity in a city, then you talk about identity at a national level. Would you add or subtract something from the thesis that you had in the book?
I think that it's a really good question. When I wrote the book, it started long before the pandemic, and I almost had given up on the idea of using the title World as Family, because I just said, it feels a little cliched. People in India use it a lot. Maybe I should not do that. And then when the pandemic happened, I realized the brilliance of the phrase, which was that the world seems such an abstracted, big idea. How do we actually handle that idea of global belonging? We can't quite fathom it. And what our Vedic ancestors had actually figured out is to compare the world to a unit called family. We all understand what family is, but we don't always understand how to deal with the world. But what I have realized is that today, what we need to go back to is the first half of that phrase from which the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam comes. And again, they were wise, the Vedic scholars, because they said, it's only of the limited mind who treat their blood relative as their family. But Udara Charitanam, or those of a magnanimous mind, know to treat the world as family. And what I realized in the beauty of that phrase was that it actually is not a foreign policy. It's not about what to do out in the world, but it's also about a value, an attitude, how to actually treat people who are not like you as part of your circle. And that idea, and I talked about this at the UN when I was asked by the Indian embassy to do a talk. And I said, the beauty of India is that we actually had learned that. And that's why everybody from all over the world who has come into India, all the way from Pliny the Elder to Alberoni, people talked about Hindustan as a place where it was not a land of Hindus as much as a land of people in it by the Indus. So just to be very clear, and they would talk about how so many different people could come to India and be together. Not that it was always peaceful, but essentially, as there are family feuds, there would be feuds, but people adjusted and accommodated. And so it is that idea of adjustment and accommodation, and therefore to treat the other not as the other, but as part of this larger human family. And that attitude is something that's unique within the Indic tradition. And how do we actually promote that? So today, I would say, is that we need to double down on the idea of treating those who are different from us as part of this larger human family. And we know from the DNA analysis that 99.9% of what we share is the same. We're always fighting over that 0.1% that is about identity. And I recognize I'm not naive. I've been around the block a few times, that the human beings are also tribal. So how to constantly fight the tribal mentality and going beyond that is actually the challenge of the day. And that has to happen no matter where you are, whether in your own family, whether in your own city, in your own country. That idea becomes more urgent than ever, because otherwise, as Gandhiji said, the eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind. And that is where we are. And so I personally feel the wisdom of that phrase is not just in Vasudeva Kutumbakam, but it is actually in the first part of that phrase.
How do we get politicians to imbibe a bit of it? And this is the other thing that I was coming to. You have in your impressive CV done just about everything, the 56 different styles or rasas that one has to have. But one of the most important things that you've done over a very long period of time has served as the CEO of Asia Society. And if I'm not wrong, the current one is Mr. Rudd, Mr. Kevin Rudd?
No, Kevin Rudd has just left in April,
right,
who's a former prime minister, and gone back to being the ambassador, the Australian ambassador to the US.
Right. But so he's a proper politician, and you are an academician, a person of ideas. The transition of kind of leading an international think tank, and I think under your leadership, it expanded in a. And one of the focus points, because that was part of the research that I was doing, was Asia Society is perhaps the only think tank that has a specific arts catalog and a program. Did that come about because you were the leader, or did that come about because art plays a huge role in diplomacy, which often goes unrecognized?
Yeah, I think that it's important, first of all, to recognize that Asia Society is not a traditional think tank. It's an international educational organization in which there is a think tank for the policy world embedded in it. But it was actually John D. Rockefeller III, our founder, in 1956, after World War II and the Korean War, who actually started the organization precisely to be multidisciplinary. He was interested in the arts and culture, he was interested in the policy, and he was interested in education. So these three became the pillars of the institution. And one of the things he was quoted as saying, even before the founding of this institution, was to say that foreign policy without cultural understanding is an empty shell. And culture, without understanding its implications in the international relations, is just a consumer thing where you imbibe and you enjoy, but you don't understand its power. And so he believed that actually both of these were important part of understanding a country and a culture. He also happened to be very, very interested in traditional Asian art. He had collected Chinese ceramics, Indian sculptures, all of that. So it also made sense for him that he gave his collection to the Asia Society while we also developed exhibition. Yeah. And I do think that it's a very prescient idea, because arts, as I was saying before, have the capacity to bridge. They have a capacity, of course, to fight too, just like anything else. But it is that capacity, and arts are part of the culture. Therefore, we need to understand the culture and its aesthetic expressions and other expressions, as we need to understand its foreign policy. In most cases all around the world, we have separated out these things too much. So it was only since the idea of the soft power that we now begin to talk about that, when it was first established in the 90s, that we talk about soft power, hard power, as well as a smart power. But it took a long time for people to get to that. Whereas Mr. Rockefeller actually had that idea. He may not have had formulated all the policy dimensions of that. And that's what we tried to do at the Asia Society. So, for example, the program I started on Asia 21, which is Young Leaders Program. And we purposely decided we wanted to have promising young people from arts, culture, foreign policy, development, NGO, all the way across from all parts of Asia, as well as America, and for these people to create networks for their own. And we were one of the first institutions to do that with that particular focus. And I do believe that it changes the conversation. If there are people from other disciplines, other arenas, but I also believe in much more of a kind of synthetic, multidisciplinary approach to issues anyway. So it made sense to do that. So I hope that makes some sense, that we need to think about arts and culture, because we know often they give rise to both tensions when misused, and they also have the possibility of connecting. As we know from the 16th century, when Sufism and Bhakti actually were hand in hand, they were looking at each other, developing some connections. And these are the things that we need to really promote more. But we often only focus on the divisive and not on the Socratic.
Right. That is true of a lot of these international think tanks. I mean, you can, without naming any of them, they're much more focused on conflicts. And sadly, the think tank that I am research directing in, our focus is also largely on these issues. But it's a good idea to kind of be more syncretic. That brings me to something that might be a bit of a and I would really want your perspective on it, because you are classically trained to do it. So we have this thing now called, and it's in the news right now because of firing and hiring, a company called OpenAI, which has an artificial intelligence tool called DALL-E. And DALL-E has this thing where you can go and you can give it a prompt, and it can paint like Monet, Picasso, and these then become, because art plays a very important role in cultural history, memory, and shaping of perceptions, which your work has very clearly outlined. We have a lot of people who've joined in today, young professionals who are from the Indian Intellectual Property Office, and students of Delhi University's program in art history, but they are interested in art history. But one of the things that kind of keeps on popping up is that Indian art is available, it's synthesized, it's used for creating these things. But because of this nature of the fact that Indian art might not be attributed, because when you gave the example of the Mughal painting, and you are somebody who would like to give a name, but because it is not attributed to a person, but a school or somebody's workshop, you don't have one name to give. While if you talk about Vermeer, if you talk about Picasso, it's one individual. What is going to happen to all of our cultural patrimony in South Asia, in China, in parts of Africa, where we can't actually put a name to the person. And new art that comes out in artificial intelligence form is just one vague geostamp and not a name to go with it. What happens to our memory then?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think, first of all, to be very clear, in China, names were very important from the earliest of painting tradition. So that
absolutely.
actually, as early as, in the 4th century, you have names of artists. And so they were far above and beyond where the Western art was, because even in Western art, until the late medieval and early Renaissance, you did not know the names of artists either.
Right.
And same thing in Greece and other places. But I think that one of the issues that my dear friend and now just passed away, Dr. Goswami, used to talk about is that because we don't have a name doesn't mean we did not know the artist. And he often gave an example of gharanas in the music or the textile tradition, that for the longest time, people would know that I'm going to go get my sari made by this guy in this particular workshop in Ahmedabad because I know he's well known for this kind of work. So people knew who they were. They didn't need their names on the thing. But it's also true that this idea of the obsession with the individual is a particularly Western Renaissance and post-Renaissance idea that is relatively late in the world. So we first have to get away from the fetishes of individuality that I think is very important. The second thing is that there's a fair amount of scholarship now where actually names are being recovered or the style of individual artists is being recovered. So we could say that so-and-so is actually in the style of this kind of an art or what have you. So we need to come up with other ways of distinguishing art that is not just about individual. And I think that's number one. Number two, that would also mean that when AI privileges individual, we have to fight that because that's not what's going to help us within the context of Indian art. And there are also, why is that so important? There are lots of other questions to ask about this art. So I personally feel that we have to think through the idea of distinguishing of art. How important is that? And I, a woman of a certain age now, after many years in the field, have come to realize that schools, classification, dating are more like a dictionary. They're not a novel. They don't make a book. You need to figure out once you, it's like a priori first stage of classification. We need to think about what are these things about within the context of where they come from and how they travel across time. Why is it that certain things get very powerful and popular and others not? What is that? There are lots of other questions to really raise. So my feeling would be that if you're worried about AI, let's first worry about the classification and the importance of classification that we give the category to, but it is only the beginning.
Right. My worry with AI is that because it becomes and it takes away a lot of attention and kind of shapes a lot of things, and it becomes a sort of force attractor, if you will. Right. But I think what you said about dictionary and novel is a very interesting and a neat categorization, which kind of brings me to something that you've spoken about in different platforms. You also written about it. In fact, there are whole sections in your book about it. So art and memory. How does art help us in our diasporic work? Somebody could be born in India and then spend the rest of their lives in the US, or so how do we kind of use art for making sense of where we are in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's clearly a role that art plays precisely because it can travel across time and place. And sometimes it's about longing. And what it is that nostalgic longing. So you see an image that you had seen when you were a child, and it brings that memory, and it makes you feel that actually art makes you feel centered somewhere else. I also feel that that nostalgia can also come in the way of not being critical. And therefore, art plays a role both in nostalgic memory, but hopefully also a reflective memory, whereby we question what is it that we remember and what it might mean. So, for example, I was trained in Bharatanatyam, classical Indian dance. I write about it in the book. When I was young, I was told how this was a classical tradition that was 3,000 years old, and it was not changed over a long period of time. And then I come to America, I'm talking about this, and I do some research. Now I'm an academician, and I actually say, you know what? How come nobody told me that it's basically reconstructed in the early 20th century as a part of a nationalist project? And it was very much a middle-class project to take away from the Devdasis, who were actually the inheritors of this. So it was incumbent on me to recognize that I changed the dialogue around that part and recognize what are the other questions around that. So I do feel that on the one hand, we have to question. On the other hand, it does make you feel comfortable. So that's okay. But let's actually keep that duality alive, because we are thinking human beings, and let's use our mind as well as our critical facilities to critique our own memory.
So essentially, the translation that happens from person to person. And again, this is something that goes back to the question about identity. So people are, on social media, everybody has a theory about who they are in the world, and they're very loud about it. How do we kind of use the intercultural space that you talk about to navigate the complexities of who I am and my place in the world?
That's one thing I am really quite worried about right now, because having the social media space, which we thought might open up the world to connect to people who are different from you, has also become a place that's just about projection. And it is not about interconnection. And it is not about connecting to people who are different from you, but only finding people who are just like you. So it's both about creating a smaller, ever smaller tribe, and at the same time, the potential of connecting. And some research has been done that says that actually folks in the global South use social media more to connect beyond their borders, whereas people in the global North are much more narrowing in terms of finding their tribe, and only come up with the micro groups that would be your own group, and then projecting to the whole world, but not connecting to the world. So I think that there is this tension in the social media that is both about its potential and the reality, and those two don't always mesh. And so therefore, I am very concerned that, especially in Euro-American world, that a lot of the young people are afraid to connect with people who are different from them. That they feel like, well, I don't have anything to say about that. And I was running this program in Global Thought. We had 40 students from 28 different countries. There, the sense was different because nobody had majority. And so everybody, and they came from different disciplines. So people were beginning to say, oh, I think this way, but you think this way. That's amazing. It's completely different. So how do you create spaces in which you are forced to confront your own biases, and you're forced to actually deal with people who are different from you, and then come together? And which I think that we have created not enough spaces for those kinds of gathering places, what I call safe places for unsafe ideas, where people can talk, but they know that they know each other, they like each other. So disagreement doesn't go into a fist fight, but that you can actually understand that people are coming different way. I mean, I'm very worried about this.
Do you think that the sharing of arts or some amount of graphics and memes, and has there been any work? I'm just curious about it because we have a professor of psychology who's joined us. Her work is on positive psychology, and one of the things I've been asking her for some time is that if you were to share a piece of art in a rapidly devolving conversation, does that make people stop and wonder about the beauty of what they're seeing and forget about their I am better than you or you are not as good as I am conversation for 30 seconds? Just want to understand, has there been any work on it?
Well, I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so I'm not completely well versed in the field. But what I do know is that a lot of my colleagues who are interested in these things recognize that what people see is what people bring to it. So for some people, they will see the beauty, but some people will see something else. And
Right.
Also art is not just about beauty, it's about social issues. It can also serve as a trigger. So in rapid succession, the only thing you can do about art is that at least it gets you outside of yourself to confront something else.
Right.
Now, what you bring to it, and that's what the rasa theory is all about, is that rasa is created in that interaction between the viewer and the thing. And that is the active process. But you, the human being, are going to bring something to it. And more trained you are, you'll bring something else. The more something else that happens, that is the variable. So you can't take away that variable of human beings.
Right.
Except that you have to actually confront and interact with something outside of yourself.
Right. So you have to be in a way out of yourself to kind of look into it.
Right.
That's one way of looking at it. So, I'm from the part of the world. I'm a dismal scientist, an economist. So our thing is value, money, pricing everywhere. So there is something that I've wanted to ask you ever since I've looked at your work and the range of it. But before that, 2 lines from William Blake. When nations grow old, the art grows cold, and commerce settles on every tree. So this was William Blake, the poet and the painter, perhaps saying that why art should not be, a value of exchange. In the last 50 years, art has ceased to be something that you appreciate. It has ceased to be a matter of aesthetic, and it has become a store of value. Nobody has access to a Picasso anymore because Picasso is $200 million. And one of the major consolations of Indian art was that it was out of the market, as it were. It was beyond this pale. But in the last 2 years, Saffron Art, which is an aggregator of Indian modern painting, they have started saying and telling everybody that now Indian art our time has come. It's a store of value now. Now, I think if you would have invested 50,000 rupees in 2021, it would be worth 1.5 lakh, 2 lakh, 3 lakh rupees today. Understandably, artists have to make money, but where does the line between private collection and its the cultural patrimony, so that it be shown to everybody, so that it is open to everybody in a museum or wherever you choose to exhibit it? How do we have that conversation? Because if somebody's bought it for X amount of money.
I think that for visual arts, or all arts, all have been both about money and about transcendence, right from the beginning. Why? Because many of the art would not have been made were it not for patronage. Somebody was asking artists to make something. And that was actually true in the ancient Greek world as it was true in the Indian world. We know from the Sanchi Stupa, for example, that there were sponsors. There were ivory makers, there were merchants. They were actually contributing and giving money to make the stupas, make the temples, make the madrasas, make the, what have you. So you did have financial part was very much a part of it. There is no way around it. The expression of that art for other people was not just about the money, but it was about all kinds of other things. So the first thing I think we have to get away from is to think that somehow art was not about money and it was only about this. It was always about both. The balance might be a little different. Similarly, I think it's important in India to recognize that actually, while saffron arts is a relatively new phenomenon, but people, even pre-independence, were buying art. Sarabais were buying art from Hussein and others long before other people were doing it, because there was a patronage of the artists, and patronage was necessary in order for the artists to survive. It may not have gone to the stratospheric thing, and I think the problem now is art as investment, and only as investment.
Yes.
So it's become exclusionary, and that becomes a problem. And so that in my world, I always, when the collectors come to me, I said, if you think you want to do it only as an investment, don't get into it, because the market is fickle. It can go down. For example, just today, Mark Rothko, that was valued at 40 million pounds, sold for only 22 million pounds. Now, 22 million is a lot of money, but the truth is that it didn't sell for what had been estimated for. So my point is that if you buy art entirely for investment reasons, you have to recognize that actually you're not buying it because you love something. You're not buying it because it speaks to you in a different way, but you're buying it entirely for one reason, and don't count on it to last long. So that's my answer to that.
No, I mean, it's the reason I asked you this question is because in the lecture that you gave at Intact, you talked about the multicultural world of coat paintings, and you kind of trace a long lineage where the coats keep on changing, but there is a successive grand design to all of this. But most of it was exhibited out. If somebody, let's say some software trillionaire, were to buy art now, it disappears in some free zone in somewhere in Switzerland. Nobody gets to see it. So my question was around that. And that brings me to a very important question, which is how do we sustain and support cultural invention and innovation?
As a historian of art, and I can give you examples that actually it takes individuals, both the artist who push the limits, want to push the limits, and possibly the patron who supports them. It doesn't come from institutions, because it's very hard for institutions to set up limits and rules and regulations, which immediately is antithetical to creating. And I give you an example of Peggy Guggenheim and Jackson Pollock. So she was one of the early people to start buying it, and that encouraged Pollock to do more work and create more ideas and more support because it was somebody else who was looking at it. Similarly, the relationship between Balwant Singh and Nainsook in the 18th century in India, small, tiny little court that actually was not very rich. But the relationship between these two was so strong that Nainsook did amazing work, all kinds of different pictures that you would never see again. And that suggests that it isn't always about big money. It isn't about a big system. It can be that, like the Mughal court, but it was because Akbar was interested, because Jahangir was interested, and they were very picky about how they looked at the art. So I do think that, and it urges and I encourages artists to even try and scale new heights. So it's both takes individuals, and I think the truth is, for countries to support art, the key would be to figure out how do you support individuals to do that work, both in terms of supporting art and making art.
Would it also not be like one of the things, well, one of the criticisms of Great Britain, for example, has been that for a very long period of time, austerity has been around. So how do you justify giving a £10,000 scholarship to art when you're asking somebody to take, budgetary cuts on healthcare? So I think, but it is a valid point. But what is the role of the artist today in these troubled times? How would you place an artist in this dynamic, chaotic landscape?
Yeah, I mean, because of this book that I'm working on, we have a big focus on artists who are very involved in social protest. And what comes up again and again is that artists, no matter where they're from, they're giving voice and concrete image to the root causes of issues on the one hand, but they're also helping us reimagine what the new world could be. So some artists are actually giving voice to a world that would be without the kind of issues that you have. Some artists are pinpointing where the issues are coming from. And often, as people say, picture speaks 1,000 words. Art also, as inchoate as it can be, actually gives voice in a much more complex way. And it reaches our emotions and sensitivities, as it's true also of music, visual arts as well as music, or even to some extent dance. So I think that art is not going to change the world by itself, but it does give voice to new possibilities and understand the causes that then can actually be satisfied or addressed through policies and social issues. But you have to really not push art to become instrumental in changing the world, because it probably is not the best way to change the world. But for example, Picasso's Guernica, it gave voice to the horror of Spanish Civil War that actually made a difference to people. And then that led to other people to do more activities and more of a power. So I think art can enable, art can help us reimagine, but art is not the one that directly will it changes your heart, but you have to change the mind, and that requires policy and strategy.
Right. This also then brings me to one of the things that you spoke about, and the late B.N. Goswami has written about it in one of his last books. There is this paradox at the heart of Indian art. A lot of it comes from what is called as traditional knowledge and cultural expression. There is a huge amount of protection in terms of IP, etc., which is available to people outside it. But a lot of the times, you've had people coming in, taking over these miniatures or whatever they produce, and then they end up in a museum outside. So how do we then kind of create a synergy that if there is a particular piece which has been found in a place far away and somebody is able to locate it, and then it can be repatriated? I'm also asking this because the current Indian government is actually going hammer and tongs about getting what it thinks it's Indian patrimony and getting it back. So how do we define what patrimony is, not just in terms of art, but also beyond it? And B, how does this then go back to the original question about identity? Because who you are or what you own.
Yeah. I think you have to ask first, why do governments and leaders want objects restituted? What is the political implications of that? I have a very good colleague in Mexico who is writing about the current government in Mexico, where they are pushing hard to have restitution, sort of jumping on the bandwagon of Benin bronzes and other kinds of restitution questions. But the real issue is that it's for the domestic political reason, whereby they're trying to say that we are a populist government, and all of these, there are objects belonging to pre-Columbian indigenous heritage. They're doing it for the indigenous community. Objects are not going to them. None of it is actually being part of the Chiapas region. And most of these objects are then getting buried back in Mexico because they don't know how to handle it, because they don't have enough possibilities to take care of these objects that are coming back. So then the first question is, what is the political motive for the restitution? Number one. Number two, if objects are that important, what are we doing with the heritage we already have in India? How are we taking care of it? Where is the conservation? What is happening to the sculptures that are in go-downs of many, 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 many museums that actually are not taken care of? So we got to ask those hard questions as well. I'm not saying don't ask for things back, but let's examine as to why we're asking and what we're asking, and do we want everything back? Is it actually good to have some things out in the world that also promotes Indian culture across? So it could be also a soft power cultural heritage policy to say, we want to do this to actually show that India had these amazing things. So it requires much more thoughtful deliberation of these issues that get to the confidence in one's identity. Identity is not just about asking for things. Identity is also about sharing with confidence. We have this to share with the world. That could be also identity.
That it is. And so this kind of very neatly...
I know we're running out of time, right?
Yes, I have been looking at so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask two more questions and then thank you and call it a day. Right. Would that be all right?
Yeah, sure.
So very simple. How does art narrow the difference between the world and home? Because that's something that you write about in the book as well.
Right. Well, I think that, as I said before, that because art has the capacity to be of a place and time and to transcend a place and time, and that actually art can exist in the world and be at home in the world. So it's a perfect petri dish for the idea of global belonging that I have defined in World as Family, which is that to belong in the world does not mean that you give up your roots. It does not mean that it's an either or, that local, national, and global are on a kind of a trajectory. It's more like a palimpsest, where some things fuse, some things remain, but those things that remain also are visible. And that's why in the book, I talk about how people ask me who I am, and I said, it depends. Depends on where I am. I have at least 6 different identities. Sometimes I'm truly an Ahmedabadi who lives in New York. Sometimes I'm an Asian American of Indian origin. Sometimes, and these are all very specific in terms of the context in which I find myself. And we all have these multiple dimensions. Art is about those multiple dimensions. It allows you to look at a thing from its particular perspective of when it originated, and it allows you to look at its life when it traverses the area, and it allows you to look at it in the current moment. And that's what our life ought to be about. Our identity should be flexible like that. And I think that that allows us to enjoy the local and the global without always putting it into antithetical positions.
Right. That brings me to the last question. And it's a very simple question. No pressure at all. What keeps you optimistic about the world?
What makes me optimistic about the world?
What keeps you optimistic?
You know, there are many, many times when I think I'm very optimistic by nature. And I always look at the glass being more half full rather than half empty. And I try to think about how to make that glass fuller from half to more full. But I also realize, and I'm realistic enough to know that the world is not going in that direction. But the one thing that keeps me optimistic is the young people. Some of you are here, but having taught young people from all over the world, and I think they're yearning for a different paradigm. They understand they're what I call global natives. They've seen the world in their palm, in their cell phone. They can connect to their friends no matter where they are. They also want to understand how to be rooted and be of the world at the same time. And I think that we adults have not done a good job of creating those paradigms. We have not done a good job of sharing that idea of specificity and expansiveness as not being antithetical to one another. But I do think that the younger people today are more worldly. All the studies show us that they're more tolerant about ideas of gender and identity. They are more tolerant of migration. They actually care about those things. But we have to provide better examples, better stories, and ways to think about this. And I don't think that we adults have done a good job with that.
Right. That's a pretty long one. But thank you so much for doing it today. And very early in the morning for you, very late in the evening for all of us here in India.
It's very late for you, but it's okay for me. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just going to ask Abhilasha to do a formal vote of thanks, and then we're going to close the session.
There is one or two questions. I'm happy to take them.
Good morning to you, ma'am. Thank you for such a wonderful lecture. I had a very simple question. Recently, a while ago, I had interacted with a group of people who do Patachitra art. And they prefer, these days, what they prefer is that their kids do not practice the art anymore. And the reason they give is because that it's very difficult to earn money, it's not sustaining. So they want their kids to have a better life. So when such a scenario comes up, how do we preserve the traditional art? Because a lot of people are trying to go towards IT industries because they make a lot of money over there. And as a result, these traditional art to some extent is dying. So how do we preserve this tradition that has been going on for a while?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a very, very common question in all developing countries. And part of it is there where the government comes in, who supports it, but is there a patronage for that? Who's going to buy it? So it's not just simply to support the art from the state by giving them some money, which some of that Indian government has done in the past. But the question is to have the patronage, because without that, it can't succeed. So to some extent, we also have to recognize that some art will die, because the tradition of Patachitra was for a particular kind of storytelling. When that idea of storytelling nobody wants to listen to, what are you going to do? So you have to recognize that there can be some support, but not everything is going to survive. And that's the nature of history. Some things will survive, some things will not, but how to make that decision is very, very difficult. And I mean, for example, revival of textiles in India is unbelievable. Why? Because now well-to-do people want to have a very special sari from Benares or from, what you name it. And the people will wait for pattern, patola. People will wait 3 years for a sari and will spend huge amounts of money. That then revives the industry. So to some extent, that's why I think we have to be somewhat practical and say that it requires support, but it requires patronage, and it requires the changing function of the society to work with that. And if all of those three things are not together, some things will die. Then you preserve what was there.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Terrific. Well, I am delighted to have this conversation with all of you, and I hope it was useful and interesting. And the book, by the way, was also published in India along with Columbia University Press. So it's published by Random House Penguin India, and it's available in paperback in India as well. I was very careful to make sure that it was Indian prices, not American prices. So
it is, and also Kindle. So, and it's a good book. So it's a recommendation for everybody to get a copy of it.
Right.
So, are there any more questions? I'm pretty sure that there are questions. It's just that people are slightly, how do I put it?
It's late. Yeah.
That's one of the things. Would it be all right, Professor, if we collect some of these questions and send them over to you?
I mean, I would like to say it's okay, but it's just a question is time.
Right.
And I'm in the middle of finishing this book. So you can send it to me and I'll see what I can do.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. They might help you in.
One very short question posted by Shivani on the chat. So if you allow, I can just read it out.
Please go ahead.
So thank you. It says, thank you, ma'am, for the interesting session. My question is, how do you think technology like Van Gogh 360 and digital platforms like Google Art and Culture have impacted the distribution and consumption of art?
I mean, I think that it does make art available in a much, much broader way than you would have otherwise. So that's the value of Google Art. I think that at the same time, one has to think about who is it available to and at what level. But I do think that on the whole, the Google Arts has really been helpful in both scholarship, having more images available for research and things of that sort.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a wonderful session, and I'm sure that everyone would agree with me on this, that how beautifully and in such a simple language, you've explained us such nitty-gritties of art. A lot of us, we are not that educated about art, but you made it so simple and sounds so easy for us to, kind of understand it, and definitely, it has intrigued a level of interest in me, and I'm sure it would have done with all other colleagues we have in this session. So thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful session, and we would really look forward to have some more such interesting sessions with you in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying so late, and have a good evening and good dinner.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Goodbye, please. Look forward to your book.